HR manager laughs at a black candidate in the lobby. Unaware it's Big Shaq. One call, one moment. A $1.9 billion merger collapses, like glass under pressure. What started as mockery turns into a corporate earthquake. Big Shaq doesn't raise his voice. He ends the game. This isn't a story about business. It's a story about power waking up. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel, and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. The lobby gleamed like a palace of ambition. All polished marble and cold glass, the air filled with faint strains of piano music piped through hidden speakers. Shaquille O'Neal, Big Shaq to those who knew his name, but here just another visitor, stepped inside. His broad frame, barely contained within a gray hoodie and well-worn jeans, drew brief glances from the polished receptionists behind the long, gleaming counter. Yet it wasn't his height or build that turned heads. It was the way he walked, as though the world might shift beneath his feet, but he'd never lose balance. Trevor Langston, the HR manager perched at a sleek corner desk, glanced up from his phone. His gaze lingered on Shaq for a fraction of a second, before curling into a smirk. He tapped a few keys, pretending to be busy. From the tailored cut of his suit to the pointed tip of his expensive loafers, Trevor reeked of entitlement. To him, the man in the hoodie was just another nobody, some hopeful walk-in who'd mistaken the towering glass doors for a Dove fair. Shaq moved with slow deliberation, as though absorbing the room with each step. His eyes drifted from the minimalist chandeliers above to the stylized company logo embossed into the floor's marble. He paused by a leather-clad bench, glancing at a digital directory that displayed the names of the company's executives. Trevor's voice floated across the lobby, thick with condescension, as he whispered to his colleague seated nearby. "Check this guy out," Trevor muttered under his breath, though loud enough to carry. "Probably here to beg for a job, or deliver lunch." The colleague, a woman named Vanessa Carlyle, snickered softly without looking up from her tablet. The quiet buzz of their amusement laced the air like a toxin, subtle but suffocating. Shaq didn't flinch. His gaze remained steady, a flicker of something deeper, wiser passing through his eyes before he sat down without a word. Trevor resumed scrolling through his phone, basking in his self-importance, unaware that his laughter was etching itself into an unfolding story he hadn't even begun to understand. Shaq's calm, his deliberate silence wasn't just patience, it was strategy. He understood this world, this polished glass fortress built on assumptions and power plays. The receptionist, a young woman named Kelly, with nervous hands and an apologetic smile, watched Shaq from the corner of her eye. Her lips parted as though to offer assistance, but Trevor's sharp glance silenced her. Shaq caught the exchange, his expression softening imperceptibly. He recognized the silent dynamics at play, the subtle fear of crossing lines, the unspoken rules of the corporate hierarchy. Outside, Los Angeles hummed beneath the glare of midday sun. Cars honked along the busy avenue, delivery trucks rumbled past, and somewhere in the distance, the faint whir of a construction crane marked progress. But inside the lobby, time seemed to slow, every second stretching longer, weighted with the quiet arrogance of men like Trevor Langston. Shaq's phone buzzed softly in his pocket. He glanced at the screen, but made no move to answer. Instead, he leaned back against the bench, his massive hands resting on his knees, his eyes scanning the entrance. People came and went, suits with sharp collars, heels clicking briskly across marble, security guards with radios clipped to their belts. No one spared him more than a passing glance. Trevor's voice broke the stillness again. "Can you believe it? Some folks just walk in here thinking they'll get a foot in the door." His laughter was thin and hollow, echoing faintly against the glass walls. Vanessa tilted her head, feigning disinterest while her eyes darted toward Shaq, assessing him with a curiosity that bordered on suspicion. "Maybe he's just lost," she offered, her tone dripping with feigned sympathy. Trevor shook his head. "Or maybe he's just desperate." The words hung in the air like smoke, curling around the lobby's silence. Shaq's lips twitched, though not in anger. His mother's voice echoed in his mind, Lucille's steady, grounding words, reminding him that dignity wasn't measured by how others treated you, but by how you carried yourself when they did. A janitor in a faded uniform passed by, pushing a cart of cleaning supplies. His name tag read Harold Jennings, and though he barely glanced at Shaq, there was a subtle nod, a silent acknowledgement of shared understanding. Shaq inclined his head slightly, a quiet exchange unnoticed by Trevor or Vanessa. The receptionist, Kelly, fidgeted with a stack of papers, her gaze darting between Shaq and Trevor. Finally, she cleared her throat, her voice barely above a whisper. "Excuse me, sir. Can I help you with something?" Shaq turned his head slowly, his deep voice rumbling low but steady. "I'm waiting for a meeting," he said simply, his tone calm, as if he had all the time in the world. Kelly's eyebrows rose slightly. "Of course. Can I get you anything while you wait?" Trevor's snicker cut across the air. "Coffee? Maybe some application forms?" Shaq's expression didn't change. He simply offered a polite smile, one that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Just water, thank you," he said. Kelly hesitated, glancing nervously at Trevor before nodding and hurrying off. Trevor leaned back in his chair, folding his arms across his chest, a smug smile playing at his lips. "These walk-ins," he muttered, shaking his head. "Always the same." But even as he spoke, Shaq's phone buzzed again. This time he slipped it from his pocket, glancing at the screen. The message was brief, a name flashing across it: Kendrick Doyle. Shaq's lips pressed into a thin line, but he made no move to leave. He simply tucked the phone back into his pocket, resuming his silent observation of the lobby's dance of assumptions. Outside, the sun cast long shadows across the lobby's floor, stripes of gold cutting through the glass like silent witnesses. Inside, the weight of unspoken prejudice thickened, every moment stretching, every assumption building toward a reckoning yet unseen. Trevor's laughter had long since faded into silence, replaced by the hollow tick of a wall-mounted clock. Shaq's calm presence, his deliberate stillness, became a silent challenge to the room's unspoken rules. The lobby had been designed to intimidate, to declare wealth and power, but in that moment, it became a stage for a different kind of power, one measured not in arrogance but in restraint. And as the clock's hands inched forward, the lobby of assumptions settled into uneasy quiet, unaware that the story unfolding within its walls was about to shatter everything it believed. Trevor Langston leaned back in his leather chair, the faint hum of the lobby's air conditioning barely masking his low, sneering voice. Through the thick pane of glass that separated his office from the main floor, he kept his eyes fixed on the man in the hoodie, Shaquille O'Neal, who sat waiting as though the rules of time didn't apply to him. Trevor's lips curled into a smirk, his voice low and conspiratorial as he turned to Vanessa Carlyle, seated across from him at a sleek glass desk littered with reports and her ever-present tablet. "Can you believe that guy's nerve?" Trevor murmured, his voice slicing through the air with a venomous edge. "Just strolls in here like he belongs. No appointment, no suit, just showing up. You know the type." Vanessa's polished nails tapped against her tablet screen, her eyes flickering briefly toward Shaq through the glass before returning to her work. "Yeah, I know the type," she said, her tone dry, rehearsed indifference laced with a hint of unease. "Probably thinks he can talk his way into a job. Or worse, looking for a handout." Trevor chuckled, a sound that grated against the quiet professionalism of the space. His voice dropped even lower, conspiratorial. "I mean, come on. Look at him. Hoodie, jeans. Clearly no idea how things work around here. He probably thinks we're a charity or something." The lobby's polished surfaces gleamed under the overhead lights, the pristine order a stark contrast to the slow, corrosive drip of prejudice that tainted Trevor's words. Through the glass, Shaq sat calmly, his eyes fixed not on the people but on the room itself, as if reading something in the architecture, the hidden codes of power etched into every corner. His hands were steady, his posture unthreatening, yet his presence felt like a quiet defiance that neither Trevor nor Vanessa could quite name. Vanessa glanced up from her tablet again, her brow knitting. "What's he even waiting for? Did he give his name at the desk?" Trevor snorted. "Who knows? Probably mumbled something. I'm sure Kelly at reception doesn't even know what to make of him." He leaned closer to the glass, his voice thick with sarcasm. "He'll be gone soon enough, once he realizes nobody's gonna come talk to him." In the lobby, Harold Jennings pushed his cart slowly past Shaq, his steps measured, the muted squeak of wheels on polished tile, the only sound accompanying him. His uniform was faded but clean, his name stitched neatly over the pocket. As he passed, his gaze met Shaq's for a brief moment, a nod, almost imperceptible, but loaded with a shared understanding. It was a gesture that cut through the surface of assumptions swirling around them, a silent acknowledgement of resilience, of quiet dignity that didn't need words. Trevor missed it entirely, too busy leaning toward Vanessa, his laughter bubbling up again. "You know, he's probably just here to waste our time," Trevor said, his voice sharp with amusement. "Thinking maybe we'll feel sorry for him. Give him a chance he doesn't deserve. He leaned back, folding his arms behind his head, his smug grin widening. But that's not how this works. He doesn't belong here. Vanessa hesitated, her fingers pausing on her screen. She opened her mouth as if to speak, then closed it, her lips pressing into a thin line. For a fleeting second, doubt flickered across her face, but it vanished as quickly as it appeared. She refocused on her work, typing briskly as if to erase the brief crack in her composure. Trevor's laughter faded into a self-satisfied silence. He drummed his fingers against the edge of his desk, his gaze locked on Shaq. He doesn't even look nervous, he murmured, almost to himself. You'd think he'd at least look nervous. But Shaq remained still, unbothered, his breathing slow and even. He wasn't looking at Trevor, or at Vanessa, or even at the receptionist. His eyes lingered on the subtle details, the way the company's logo gleamed gold against the dark wood of the reception desk, the unobtrusive cameras mounted in the corners, the ripple of discomfort passing through the security guards when they glanced his way. To the untrained eye, it might seem like he was simply waiting, but to anyone paying closer attention, it was clear he was watching, absorbing every nuance of this place, where judgments were made long before anyone spoke a word. Vanessa finally looked up, her voice quieter, less sure. Should we maybe check with the front desk? See if he's here for something? Trevor waved a dismissive hand. Please. He's probably just some joker who wandered in off the street. No need to bother. He'll get bored and leave. But the glass didn't muffle everything. The faintest sound of Shaq's phone buzzing reached them, a vibration so subtle it might have been missed if not for Trevor's momentary pause. He frowned, watching as Shaq glanced at the screen, his face unreadable. The name Kendrick Doyle flashed briefly before Shaq silenced the phone and tucked it away. There was no urgency, no sign of frustration, just that same steady patience, that same quiet presence that had unnerved Trevor from the moment he walked in. Trevor's smirk faltered, his fingers stilling against the desk. Who do you think he's texting? He muttered half to himself. Vanessa shrugged, her voice tighter now. Maybe he's not what he seems. Trevor scoffed, though the sound lacked conviction. Don't be ridiculous. Look at him. But Vanessa's gaze lingered on Shaq, something flickering behind her eyes, unease, or perhaps the faintest hint of recognition. Maybe we should double-check, she said softly, almost as if the suggestion had formed without her realizing it. Trevor straightened in his chair, forcing a laugh that rang hollow. What, you think he's someone important? In that getup? He gestured dismissively toward Shaq's hoodie and jeans, his bravado faltering against the growing silence that settled over the room. Outside, the world carried on, cars speeding down the avenue, the faint wail of a siren in the distance. But inside, the air felt heavier, as if the building itself was holding its breath. Trevor's confidence wavered, his smirk slipping just enough to betray a crack in the polished facade. Vanessa's hands hovered uncertainly over her tablet, her fingers no longer tapping. The lobby remained unchanged, its glossy surfaces gleaming under the muted lights. Shaq's figure, calm and unassuming, remained exactly where it had been. But the dynamics within the glass-walled office had shifted subtly, the confidence in Trevor's voice now tinged with a note of hesitation he couldn't quite explain. Through the glass, Shaq's gaze lifted for a moment, meeting Trevor's directly. It was a brief connection, no more than a few seconds. But in that gaze was something that neither Trevor nor Vanessa could define, a quiet knowing, a certainty that transcended the walls and assumptions that surrounded them. The moment passed, leaving Trevor staring at his own reflection in the glass, unsettled by something he couldn't name. Vanessa cleared her throat, her voice breaking the silence. Maybe we should at least ask his name. Trevor hesitated, his fingers tightening on the armrest of his chair. The easy arrogance that had colored his voice was gone, replaced by a brittle silence that stretched between them. Finally, he forced a laugh. But it sounded thin, almost desperate. Sure, go ahead, but I'm telling you, he's nobody. Yet as the minutes ticked by, as Shaq sat quietly in the lobby, as the unspoken tension built like an approaching storm, it became increasingly clear that Trevor's assumptions might soon collapse under the weight of something far bigger than he could imagine. The lobby's polished silence wrapped around Shaquille O'Neal like a tailored suit, but his thoughts drifted far from the sterile luxury of glass and chrome. As he sat, the hum of distant conversations and the soft click of heels on marble faded, replaced by the echoes of a life lived in pursuit of purpose. He was born in Newark, New Jersey, in 1972, to Lucille O'Neal, a determined young woman who faced the challenges of teenage motherhood with unwavering resolve. His biological father, Joe Toney, struggled with addiction and eventually relinquished his parental rights. Shaq's stepfather, Philip Harrison, a disciplined Army sergeant, stepped into the paternal role, instilling in Shaq the values of discipline and resilience. Lucille's voice, firm yet nurturing, often echoed in his mind, "Walk like you have somewhere to go." She emphasized the importance of purpose and presence, lessons she detailed in her memoir, "Walk Like You Have Somewhere to Go." Growing up, Shaq's family moved frequently due to his stepfather's military assignments, including a significant period in Germany. It was there that a chance encounter with LSU coach Dale Brown set the stage for his future. Recognizing Shaq's potential, Brown encouraged him to pursue basketball seriously. Upon returning to the U.S., Shaq attended Cole High School in San Antonio, Texas, leading the basketball team to a remarkable 68-1 record over 2 seasons. At Louisiana State University, Shaq's dominance on the court was undeniable. He was named the Southeastern Conference Player of the Year in 1991 and 1992, and was a consensus first-team All-American in both seasons. In 1992, Shaq entered the NBA draft and was selected first overall by the Orlando Magic. His impact was immediate. He was named Rookie of the Year and quickly became one of the league's most formidable centers. His tenure with the Magic culminated in a trip to the NBA Finals in 19. Seeking greater challenges, Shaq signed a 7-year, $120 million contract with the Los Angeles Lakers in 1996. Teaming up with a young Kobe Bryant, the duo led the Lakers to 3 consecutive championships from 2000 to 2002, with Shaq earning Finals MVP honors each time. In 2004, Shaq was traded to the Miami Heat, where he secured his 4th NBA championship in 2006, alongside Dwyane Wade. His later years in the NBA included stints with the Phoenix Suns, Cleveland Cavaliers, and Boston Celtics, before retiring in. Beyond basketball, Shaq demonstrated a keen business acumen. He invested in various ventures, including owning numerous franchise restaurants and launching his own chain, Big Chicken. His endorsement deals and business investments have significantly contributed to his estimated net worth of $500 million. Throughout his journey, Shaq remained grounded, attributing much of his success to the foundational lessons imparted by his mother. Lucille's emphasis on humility, strength, and purpose resonated deeply with him, guiding his decisions both on and off the court. As he sat in the lobby, reflecting on his past, Shaq's demeanor remained calm and composed. The whispered judgments and dismissive glances from others in the room did not perturb him. He understood the power of patience and the strength that comes from knowing one's worth. The legacy he carried was not just of athletic prowess but of resilience, wisdom, and an unwavering commitment to integrity. The low hum of the lobby continued. As Shaq rose from his seat, the motion slow and unhurried, like a giant quietly stretching in the middle of a chessboard. His hoodie creased softly at his shoulders as he slipped one hand into his pocket, fingers grazing the cool edge of his phone. He glanced once toward the receptionist's desk, where Kelly glanced up and then quickly down, feigning focus on her screen. Trevor and Vanessa, watching from their glass-paneled perch, leaned subtly closer, though their expressions tried to mask their curiosity. Shaq turned, his massive frame casting a shadow over the polished floor, and stepped toward a quiet alcove to the side of the lobby, a space flanked by oversized potted plants and a large abstract sculpture. It wasn't hidden, but it was just far enough from the reception area that his voice, when he finally spoke, was swallowed by the gentle murmur of lobby noise. He pulled the phone from his pocket, thumbed across the screen and brought it to his ear. His voice, low and even, murmured into the receiver, "Kendrick, it's me." On the other end, Kendrick Doyle's voice was a controlled whisper, but the tension threaded through each word was unmistakable. "You good, boss?" "Everything's as expected," Shaq said, his tone almost casual, but there was a weight behind the words, an invisible hand tightening around the edges of the conversation. "They're playing their part, just like we thought they would." Kendrick's breath caught softly, a hesitation that hinted at the storm building quietly on the other end of the line. "Do you want me to proceed?" Shaq's gaze wandered over the lobby as he listened to the distant murmur of Trevor's voice, the faint shuffle of feet, the clink of glass from a passing service cart. "Hold for now," he said, voice smooth as silk but taut as a drawn wire. "Let them think they've got this under control." Kendrick's voice dropped even lower, a rasp threading through the connection. "Understood. But just say the word, and we'll pull the trigger." Shaq's lips curved into a faint, almost imperceptible smile, though his eyes remained flat and unreadable. No triggers yet, he murmured. Let's just let the pieces move a little more. Keep everyone calm. Quiet's good. The call ended with a soft click, the sound absorbed by the muted lobby acoustics. Shaq slipped the phone back into his pocket, exhaled a breath that was neither relief nor tension, but something more deliberate, an exhale of control. His shoulders rolled back, his stance shifting subtly as he turned, re-entering the open space of the lobby with the same quiet authority he'd brought in with him. Trevor, still half watching from his glass enclosure, raised an eyebrow and leaned toward Vanessa. "Who do you think he was talking to?" he murmured, his voice light but tinged with an unease that hadn't been there earlier. Vanessa hesitated, her lips tightening, her gaze flicking briefly from Trevor's face to Shaq's calm figure, moving across the lobby. "Doesn't seem like it's anyone we know," she said softly, though her words sounded more like a question than a statement. The receptionist, Kelly, cleared her throat quietly as Shaq approached. "Would you like that water now, sir?" she asked, her voice polite, but carrying an undercurrent of uncertainty, as if she sensed something beneath the surface that she couldn't quite name. Shaq nodded, his expression gentle, almost kind. "Thank you. Yes, that would be great." As Kelly turned to retrieve the glass, Shaq glanced back toward the lobby's expanse. The polished floors, the high ceilings, the soft pulse of business as usual. His mind played back Kendrick's voice, the weight of those words. Just say the word, and the knowledge that a single decision could shift the ground beneath every smug assumption in this building. He moved back to his bench, lowering himself into the same seat he had occupied earlier, his presence steady and unyielding. The lobby's hum continued, oblivious to the undercurrent of tension now coiling just beneath the surface. Outside, traffic crawled along the sunlit avenue, horns occasionally breaking the calm, but inside it was as if the world was holding its breath. Trevor's smirk had faltered, his earlier confidence wobbled by the quiet phone call that had lasted barely a minute, but seemed to have tilted the balance of the room. Vanessa shifted in her seat, her fingers tapping against her tablet without typing. Shaq's patience wasn't passive. It was a weapon honed by years of being underestimated, by the weight of expectation and judgment, by the long lessons learned on and off the court. He knew how to wait, how to let the room speak for itself, how to let silence draw out truths no one wanted to admit. As he sat, his thoughts wandered, not to the smirks or the whispers but to his mother's voice, still echoing faintly from years ago. Patience isn't waiting to act. It's knowing when the moment matters. He heard her words as clearly as if she were sitting beside him, her hands folded in her lap, her steady gaze meeting his. Shaq's phone vibrated once more in his pocket, a brief pulse, but he didn't reach for it. Instead, he let the moment stretch, the lobby stillness deepening around him. He knew Kendrick would wait, that the next move was his to decide. Kelly returned with a glass of water, her hands trembling slightly as she set it down on the small table beside him. "Here you go, sir," she said, her voice almost too quiet. Shaq offered a nod, his deep voice warm but measured. "Thank you." As she retreated, her eyes darted once toward Trevor's glass-walled office, where Trevor now stood stiffly, arms crossed, his gaze locked onto Shaq with an unease he couldn't quite conceal. The tension in the room was palpable now, like the charged air before a storm. The quiet call, unseen by most, had sent ripples through the carefully constructed facade of the lobby's daily routine. The chessboard was shifting, and though Trevor and Vanessa still clung to their assumptions, the edges of doubt had begun to creep into their carefully rehearsed dismissiveness. Shaq sat back, his broad shoulders relaxed, his expression calm, his gaze once more sweeping the lobby. The weight of his quiet authority filled the space, a silent promise that the balance of power was far more fragile than anyone there could guess. The lobby had returned to its hum of muted activity, but the truth hovered just beneath the surface, waiting for the next move. Outside, the sun dipped slightly, casting longer shadows across the city. Inside, the lobby of glass and steel waited with bated breath for what would come next. Vanessa Carlyle glanced again through the glass panel, her gaze narrowing as she caught sight of the man in the hoodie, the one who was supposed to be a nobody, waiting in a lobby where people like him didn't linger. She had dismissed him earlier, reassured by Trevor's arrogance, by the casual assumptions they both leaned on like crutches. But now something about the way he sat there, unbothered, waiting with the patience of someone who knew the world would catch up to him, gnawed at her confidence. She turned her attention back to her tablet, tapping through reports and schedules with a growing sense of distraction. Numbers, names, and proposals blurred into meaningless symbols. It was supposed to be a routine day, The merger, the meetings, the expected shuffle of power and paperwork. But this man's continued presence felt like a stone in her shoe, irritating and impossible to ignore. Finally, she set her tablet down and stood, smoothing her skirt as if she were preparing for a casual stroll. "I'm going to check on something," she murmured, more to herself than to Trevor, who was too absorbed in his own smug sense of control to notice her rising unease. She stepped out of the glass-walled office, heels clicking softly against the polished floor, her movements fluid yet tinged with a stiffness that betrayed her inner conflict. Kelly at reception looked up as Vanessa approached, her expression wary, as though she already knew what Vanessa was about to ask. "Kelly," Vanessa said, keeping her tone light, almost conspiratorial. "Could you pull up the visitor log for me?" Kelly hesitated, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. "Of course, Miss Carlyle," she said, her voice measured. She tapped a few keys, the screen flickering softly before displaying the digital log. Kelly stepped aside, giving Vanessa a clear view of the list. Vanessa scanned the entries, her brow furrowing. Names scrolled by, standard appointments, delivery entries, and scheduled meetings, until her gaze caught on a line that made her pulse quicken. "O'Neill, private appointment," it read, the timestamp coinciding precisely with the arrival of the man in the hoodie. A cold prickle crept down her spine. Her lips pressed into a thin line as she reread the entry, her mind racing to rationalize what she was seeing. It had to be a coincidence. There were plenty of O'Neills in the world. Maybe it was a common name, a mistake in the system, or even a prank by someone trying to stir up a reaction. But deep down, Vanessa felt the weight of something heavier pressing against her rationalizations. The calm way the man sat there. The subtle nod from the janitor earlier. The quiet phone call that had clearly rattled Trevor more than he cared to admit. It all painted a picture she didn't want to acknowledge. She straightened her shoulders, forcing her thoughts into a more controlled cadence. "Did he say who he was here to meet?" she asked, her voice carefully modulated, though Kelly's slight hesitation didn't go unnoticed. "He just said he had a private appointment, ma'am," Kelly replied quietly. "Didn't give any details." Vanessa's lips tightened. She felt the beginnings of unease worm their way into her chest. Private appointments weren't unheard of, especially with high-level clients or silent investors, but the way this was handled, no formal greeting, no announcement, felt off. Still, she wasn't ready to abandon the comfortable narrative she and Trevor had spun. "Probably just someone with an inflated sense of importance," she said dismissively, though her voice lacked conviction. "Maybe he thinks dropping a big name will get him in faster." But as she turned away from the reception desk, her footsteps echoing softly, her mind refused to settle. She glanced once more toward the man in the hoodie, noting the calm way he sipped the glass of water Kelly had brought him. He didn't look impatient. He didn't look concerned. If anything, he seemed to be waiting for something, or someone, with a quiet certainty that unsettled her. Vanessa returned to the glass-walled office, her movements less confident than before. Trevor glanced up, his smirk faltering as he caught the subtle shift in her demeanor. "Find out what he's doing here," he asked, though the bravado in his voice had thinned. "Nothing," Vanessa said lightly, though her voice was brittle. "Just a name in the log. Probably a coincidence." Trevor raised an eyebrow. "A name? What name?" Vanessa hesitated, then sighed. "O'Neill. S. O'Neill." For a moment, silence stretched between them, thick as molasses. Trevor's mouth tightened, the corners pulling into a frown. "O'Neill," he echoed, his voice low. "That doesn't mean anything. Just a common name." "Exactly," Vanessa said quickly, though her pulse was beating faster now. Could be anyone. But the unease lingered, threading through her thoughts like a persistent whisper. She sat back down, tapping her nails against the edge of her tablet, her mind spinning with possibilities. If this man was who she was beginning to suspect, then everything about the morning, the dismissive comments, the laughter, the arrogance, took on a dangerous edge. Trevor seemed to sense her shifting mood. "You're overthinking it," he said, though his voice lacked the easy confidence it had carried earlier. "He's just some walk-in, trying to throw his weight around. Happens all the time." Vanessa wanted to believe him, but the memory of the visitor log, of that quiet, unassuming entry, gnawed at her. She found herself watching the man in the hoodie through the glass, noting the ease with which he waited, the way he seemed to command the space without a single word. It wasn't the posture of a man trying to bluff his way into a meeting. It was the posture of someone who knew he belonged, and who was willing to wait as long as it took for others to realize it. The psychological tension curled tighter around her chest. her breath growing shallow as she considered the implications. If this was the Shaquille O'Neal, the real Big Shaq, then the situation was far more precarious than either she or Trevor had imagined. And if he was here for something tied to the merger they were so sure would go through, then their assumptions weren't just careless, they were dangerous. Still, she forced herself to stay seated, her expression carefully schooled into neutrality. Trevor resumed his idle scrolling, though his glances toward the lobby were more frequent now, more uncertain. The tension between them thickened, a silent acknowledgement of the doubt they both felt, but weren't ready to voice aloud. Vanessa's mind spun with calculations. If it was him, why hadn't he announced himself? Why the hoodie, the quiet presence, the discreet phone call? The answers eluded her, leaving only questions that made her increasingly uneasy. She risked one more glance toward the visitor log on Kelly's screen, her thoughts churning. Ass O'Neal. Private appointment. No more details. It felt like a riddle, one she wasn't sure she wanted to solve. But the longer the man sat there, the harder it became to dismiss the possibility that their assumptions had led them to underestimate, not just him but the consequences of their own arrogance. As the minutes stretched on, Vanessa's curiosity twisted into anxiety, each tick of the clock tightening the knot in her stomach. The man in the hoodie remained exactly where he was, waiting with a patience that now felt almost predatory. She realized, with a cold flush of dread, that whatever he was waiting for, it wasn't going to be something they could control. And in that quiet realization she understood that their morning's comfortable assumptions were unraveling, thread by thread, into something far more dangerous than they had imagined. Inside the executive suite, the air was thick with the scent of power, subtle colognes, polished leather, and the crisp notes of freshly printed contracts. Cameron Blackwood, CEO of the company, perched at the top of this glass fortress, leaned back in his high-backed chair, a glass of aged scotch cradled in his hand. His gaze flicked across the sprawling skyline of downtown Los Angeles, visible through the floor-to-ceiling windows behind him, as though the city itself was a chessboard and he the master strategist. Trevor Langston stood nearby, his posture too eager, a sycophantic grin tugging at the corners of his mouth. He cradled his own glass, a pale imitation of Cameron's effortless poise. They were discussing the impending merger with Falconridge Technologies, a deal worth $1.9 billion that would, in their minds, solidify their dominance in the industry. Trevor rattled off numbers and projections with a rehearsed confidence, each word more for his own reassurance than for Cameron's. Cameron's laughter was low and controlled, like the rumble of distant thunder. "It's all but locked in," he said, swirling the scotch in his glass. "Falconridge is desperate to close. Once this is done, we'll be untouchable." Trevor nodded, though his mind was not fully on the numbers. His thoughts flickered back to the lobby, to the man in the hoodie. It bothered him more than he admitted. The man's calm, his patience, it had unsettled Trevor in a way he couldn't quite articulate, though he tried to brush it off with the same easy arrogance he projected here. "There was some guy hanging around in the lobby," Trevor said, forcing a laugh. "Showed up without an appointment. Looked like he thought he was going to talk his way into something." Cameron raised an eyebrow, the corner of his mouth curling in faint amusement. "Really? Some nobody off the street?" "Exactly," Trevor said, emboldened. "Probably thought dropping a name would get him in. Claimed he had a private appointment. You know the type, showy, but no substance." Cameron's chuckle was dry, dismissive. "Let security handle it. People like that think they can walk into our world and disrupt things. They don't realize how far out of their depth they really are." Trevor echoed the laugh, though the unease still gnawed at him. He couldn't shake the memory of the visitor log, so Neal, and the faint sense that they might have underestimated the man sitting quietly just a few floors below them. But in the glow of the executive suite, surrounded by glass and steel, and the heady rush of impending victory, it was easy to let the doubt fade into the background. They turned back to the merger documents, their voices threading through the air like silk-wrapped daggers. "Falconridge will fold right into our operations," Cameron said smoothly. "Their tech, their patents, it'll all be ours, and the market will follow. They won't have a choice." Trevor leaned in, nodding eagerly. "We've already got the press releases drafted. As soon as the papers are signed, we'll flood the media with it. Make it look like we've pulled off the impossible." Cameron's smile sharpened. "That's the game, Trevor. Control the narrative, control the power, make them believe they're watching brilliance in motion, even when we're just moving pieces into place." They toasted, the clink of glass echoing faintly in the high-ceilinged room. But beneath the surface of their conversation, An undercurrent of tension threaded through Trevor's thoughts. He kept glancing at his phone, half expecting a message, a call, something that would confirm his growing suspicion. The man in the hoodie wasn't just a random interloper. There was something more to him, something that didn't fit the neat story they were telling themselves. "Relax," Cameron said, noticing Trevor's distraction. "This is our moment. Nothing's going to derail it." Trevor forced a smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Of course," he murmured, though his mind replayed the man's calm, the quiet phone call, the name in the log. It was all too precise, too controlled. He glanced at the merger documents spread out on the table, the numbers blurring as a cold knot tightened in his stomach. Cameron leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial tone. "You know what the real beauty of this deal is, Trevor? It's not just the money, it's the way it locks everyone else out. The competition will scramble, but we'll already have the patents, the talent. They won't stand a chance." Trevor nodded mechanically, but the weight of his earlier arrogance pressed against his chest. He thought of the janitor's nod, the receptionist's hesitation, the steady way the man had sat there, unbothered by the dismissive laughter. It felt like a puzzle he hadn't been sharp enough to solve in time. As Cameron continued outlining post-merger strategies, his voice smooth and confident, Trevor's phone vibrated against the table. He snatched it up, glancing at the screen. A brief message, no name, just a quiet reminder that the world outside this glass fortress was moving, and not always according to plan. He hesitated, thumb hovering over the screen, before slipping the phone back into his pocket. The conversation resumed, filled with boasts of power plays and strategic acquisitions, but Trevor's mind remained half-rooted in the lobby below, where one man's silence felt more dangerous than any shouted protest. Cameron poured another measure of scotch, his confidence unwavering. "By the time anyone realizes what we've done, it'll be too late. We'll be untouchable." Trevor nodded again, though his throat felt dry. He forced himself to echo the laughter, to match the easy arrogance of the room, but the cracks were widening beneath the surface. The merger that had seemed so certain now felt like a fragile construct, a castle built on assumptions that might crumble with a single miscalculation. As the meeting dragged on, the city outside continued its afternoon pulse cars crawling through sunlit streets, sirens wailing faintly in the distance, the subtle buzz of life moving forward. But inside the boardroom, the walls seemed to close in, the polished surfaces reflecting a confidence that was beginning to feel hollow. Trevor stole one last glance toward his phone, the faint weight of dread settling deeper into his chest. The man in the hoodie hadn't left. He was still there, waiting. And somehow Trevor sensed that whatever was coming next would not be as easily dismissed as they'd hoped. Cameron's voice rang out, cutting through Trevor's reverie. "You're distracted, Trevor. What's on your mind?" "Nothing," Trevor lied quickly, his smile too bright. "Just running through the final steps in my head." Cameron studied him for a moment, then shrugged, returning his attention to the documents. "Good. Stay sharp. We're almost there." Trevor nodded, but as the conversation resumed, his thoughts kept circling back to the man waiting silently below. The arrogance that had carried him through the morning now felt like a brittle mask, one that might crack the moment the truth surfaced. Outside the boardroom's glass walls, the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the city skyline. Inside, the air grew heavier, the weight of impending consequences settling over the room like an invisible storm. And in the lobby below, the man they had dismissed continued to wait, calm and patient, his silence echoing louder than any words. Shaquille O'Neal sat for a while longer, his massive frame settled into the understated comfort of the lobby's leather seating. The world around him hummed with quiet corporate order. The soft shuffle of footsteps, the faint echo of distant conversation, and the muted click of keyboards behind the reception desk. Yet beneath this veneer of routine, a subtle shift in atmosphere began to ripple, like the first tremors of an unseen quake. After a beat, Shaq rose slowly, his movement graceful, despite his size. His hoodie, rumpled at the shoulders, rustled faintly. As he straightened, he scanned the room once more, not hurriedly, not as if searching for anyone in particular, but as though he was simply taking in the final details of a scene before stepping onto a new stage. The security badge clipped to his pocket, small, official, almost hidden, glinted briefly under the overhead lights. It was a detail easy to miss, unless one was paying close attention. He approached the reception desk, his strides deliberate and unthreatening, a subtle counterpoint to Trevor Langston's earlier swagger. Kelly, the receptionist, glanced up, her eyes widening just slightly at the sight of him approaching. She had watched him sit in silence, field a brief phone call, and now rise as though the moment had finally arrived to change the air in the room. Her hands, poised above her keyboard, hovered uncertainly. "Could I get a glass of water, please?" Shaq asked, his voice warm and soft, its depth resonating against the sterile surfaces of the lobby. His tone was polite, almost gentle, yet it carried a quiet authority, as though the request were not just for water but for a recognition of presence. Kelly blinked, her lips parting as though surprised that this man, who had waited so long and so quietly, was now making such a simple human request. She nodded quickly, a faint flush rising to her cheeks. "Of course, sir," she murmured, stepping away from the desk to fetch the water. Behind the glass-walled office, Trevor's head turned sharply, his smirk faltering as he noticed Shaq's movement. He leaned closer to Vanessa Carlyle, who sat still with her tablet, her gaze flickering between Shaq and the visitor log. The tension coiled between them, unspoken but palpable. Trevor's earlier laughter had faded into a thin line of unease. The man they'd dismissed wasn't leaving, wasn't fading into the background as expected. Instead, he was asserting himself with the quiet dignity of someone who knew precisely what he was doing. The lobby's polished floors reflected the glint of Shaq's badge, the subtle tightening of Kelly's posture as she returned with the glass of water, her hands trembling slightly. She placed it on the counter with a soft clink of glass against marble. "Here you go, sir," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Shaq inclined his head in a gentle nod, his deep voice steady. "Thank you." He took the glass in his large hand, the clear water catching the light, refracting it across his fingers like liquid crystal. He didn't drink immediately. Instead, he stood there for a moment, his presence filling the space without a hint of aggression. His silence was a steady pulse against the brittle noise of the lobby, the measured breathing of a man accustomed to watching and waiting for the precise moment to act. Vanessa's fingers tapped against her tablet, but the motion was more nervous than productive. Her mind replayed the visitor log, the name, S. O'Neill, flashing in her thoughts like a warning beacon. She shifted in her seat, her heels brushing softly against the floor, as if preparing to stand but not quite willing to cross the invisible line drawn by her earlier dismissiveness. Trevor's posture stiffened. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, his voice dropping into a conspiratorial whisper. "What's he playing at?" he muttered, though the question seemed more to himself than to Vanessa. His earlier bravado had drained away, leaving behind a brittle edge of uncertainty. Shaq turned slightly, his gaze sweeping the lobby once more. The camera, in a cinematic sense, would have lingered on the small details, the flicker of Kelly's nervous smile, the tight clench of Trevor's jaw, the faint shimmer of the security badge, the quiet clink of glass, as Shaq finally raised the water to his lips. He sipped slow and deliberate, as though savoring the moment, not for the water itself, but for the clarity it represented. The hum of tension in the lobby thickened, an almost tangible weight pressing down on the polished surfaces and glass walls. Conversations hushed, footsteps slowed, and even the distant ringing of a phone in a nearby office seemed to fade into silence. Shaq's calm presence became the axis around which the entire room pivoted, his quiet command of the space a stark contrast to Trevor's earlier arrogance. Vanessa's pulse quickened, her hands tightening on her tablet. She glanced toward Trevor, her voice low but urgent. "Maybe we should check just to be sure." Trevor shook his head, though his confidence wavered. "It's nothing," he insisted, but his voice lacked conviction. "He's just trying to make us nervous." Vanessa wasn't convinced. She stood slowly, smoothing her skirt, her gaze never leaving Shaq as he placed the half-empty glass of water back on the counter, with a soft, deliberate finality. He didn't speak, didn't demand, didn't assert himself with bluster or entitlement. Instead, he turned, his movements measured, and returned to his seat in the lobby. He sat as he had before, hands resting lightly on his knees, gaze steady, presence undeniable. Trevor's voice was tight, as he muttered, "Why isn't he leaving? What the hell is he waiting for?" Vanessa's lips pressed into a thin line, her thoughts swirling with possibilities she didn't want to name. The visitor log, the badge, the quiet call. Each piece of the puzzle clicked into place with a soft, ominous resonance. But it was Shaq's patience, his refusal to be rushed or rattled, that unsettled her most. It wasn't the behavior of a man bluffing his way into a meeting. It was the behavior of someone who knew that the real power came from waiting until others revealed themselves. As the lobby settled back into its muted rhythm, Shaq's quiet shift, the simple act of rising, requesting a glass of water, and resuming his seat, left a crack in the polished facade of the morning's assumptions. The subtle shift wasn't dramatic or loud. It was a precise, almost imperceptible maneuver, like a master chess player nudging a pawn into position, waiting for the board to tip in his favor. The receptionist's hands trembled slightly as she returned to her desk. Trevor's knuckles whitened against his knees. Vanessa stood by the glass, her gaze locked on the man who sat there, silent and composed, his presence now impossible to ignore. And in the quiet that followed, the hum of tension remained, a low, steady pulse beneath the surface of routine, waiting to erupt. The lobby's quiet hum stretched, a taut line vibrating just below the surface of the glass and marble. Shaquille O'Neal sat with the same patient calm he'd maintained all morning. His broad shoulders relaxed, his hands resting lightly on his knees. The water glass was gone, the traces of condensation evaporating from the counter as if the air itself sensed the approaching storm. The elevator bell chimed, a soft, elegant sound that sliced through the tension like a whispered promise. The doors parted, and Kendrick Doyle stepped into the lobby. He was sharply dressed, his tailored suit cutting clean lines, a deliberate contrast to Shaq's casual hoodie and jeans. His polished shoes clicked softly against the floor. As he approached, his expression composed, but his eyes sharp with intent. The receptionist, Kelly, straightened abruptly, her hands fluttering as if caught between instinct and professionalism. She barely managed to stammer a greeting before Kendrick's voice, low and smooth, filled the space. "Mr. O'Neal," Kendrick said, his tone precise, carrying the weight of deference and respect. The silence that followed was absolute, a stillness that seemed to absorb every sound in the room. Trevor, watching from behind the glass walls, went rigid, his breath hitched audibly, the color draining from his face as realization bloomed, slow and devastating. He shot a panicked glance toward Vanessa, whose lips parted in silent shock, her tablet forgotten in her hands. Shaq rose slowly, his movements unhurried, a deliberate unfolding of his presence. He turned to face Kendrick, his deep voice calm as he responded. "Kendrick, good to see you." Trevor stumbled out of the office, his steps too quick, his voice cracking as he tried to reassert control. "Wait, Mr. O'Neal?" he stammered, his earlier smugness shattered, replaced by a brittle desperation. I didn't realize." Shaq didn't even glance in his direction. His gaze remained on Kendrick, his expression steady, almost gentle, but undercut by a subtle steeliness that left no room for doubt. The lobby, so meticulously curated to project power and prestige, suddenly felt like a fragile stage, its foundations crumbling beneath the weight of unspoken truths. Kendrick's voice was quiet but carried with it the finality of a judge's gavel. "The board has been informed. The merger with Falconridge is off the table. Effective immediately." Trevor's face twisted in disbelief, his mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. But the merger is this deal is essential." Shaq's voice, when it finally cut through Trevor's babbling, was smooth and resonant, carrying the weight of layered experiences, of battles fought in boardrooms and on basketball courts, of moments where silence spoke louder than any outburst. "The deal was built on assumptions," he said quietly, his tone even but devastating. "Assumptions about who's important, who deserves respect, who holds the real power." Vanessa, pale and visibly shaken, took a hesitant step forward. "Mr. O'Neal, this was just a misunderstanding. If we'd known." Shaq turned his gaze to her, and though his expression remained calm, there was an unspoken challenge in his eyes. "You didn't ask," he said simply. "You assumed." The words echoed in the lobby, the quiet finality of them, more cutting than any accusation. Trevor's shoulders sagged, his earlier confidence crumbling into something hollow and panicked. "We can fix this," he insisted weakly. "We can sit down, talk this through." Kendrick's glance toward Shaq was a silent question, but Shaq's slow shake of his head made it clear. The time for discussion was over. "The merger was never yours to control," Shaq said, his voice low but carrying the weight of unshakable certainty. "You saw what you wanted to see, a man in a hoodie, sitting quietly, waiting. You decided that meant weakness, or desperation, or insignificance. You never considered that the real power doesn't always announce itself." Trevor opened his mouth again, but the words died in his throat. The people in the lobby, receptionists, security guards, assistants, watched in stunned silence, the carefully curated facade of corporate dominance peeling away like cheap wallpaper. Shaq's gaze swept the room, meeting the eyes of those who had dismissed him, who had whispered and chuckled, who had believed that power wore tailored suits and expensive shoes. He didn't need to raise his voice or make threats. The truth of his presence, the layered history behind his calm, the strategic patience that had let them all reveal themselves, was enough. Kendrick stepped closer, his voice smooth but laced with quiet authority. The withdrawal of the merger will be public by the end of the day, he said. There's nothing to salvage here. Trevor's knees seemed to buckle, his hands gripping the edge of a nearby chair, as though it could anchor him against the unraveling of his carefully constructed world. Vanessa stood frozen, her thoughts visible in the tight lines of her face, her earlier dismissiveness now replaced by a dawning understanding of how thoroughly they had misread the situation. Shaq turned back to Kendrick. "Let's go," he said simply. As he moved toward the exit, the weight of his silent judgment lingered in the air, a palpable force pressing down on the lobby's gleaming surfaces. Kelly, the receptionist, stepped aside quickly, her eyes wide, her cheeks flushed. Shaq offered her a polite nod, a quiet acknowledgement of her earlier courtesy, her hesitant attempt to offer respect where others had withheld it. Trevor's voice, thin and desperate, followed them. "Please, Mr. O'Neill, this is a mistake. We can make it right." But Shaq didn't look back. The power in his retreat wasn't in the volume of his voice or the harshness of his words. It was in the quiet certainty that he no longer needed to prove anything. His presence alone had dismantled their assumptions, exposed the hollowness of their arrogance, and reminded them that true power doesn't need permission to exist. As he stepped into the elevator, Kendrick at his side, the doors slid shut behind them, with a soft final click. The lobby remained suspended in a heavy silence, the echoes of Shaq's words lingering like smoke in the air. Trevor collapsed into a nearby chair, his face ashen, his thoughts spinning in frantic circles as the full weight of what had just happened settled over him. Vanessa stood still, her mind replaying every dismissive glance, every whispered comment, every assumption that now felt like a trap of their own making. In that moment, the world shifted. The $1.9 billion merger, the carefully plotted strategies, the unchallenged arrogance, they all dissolved under the quiet, unyielding force of truth. And as the city beyond the glass walls continued its endless hum, the lobby of assumptions was left cracked and silent, the real lesson seared into the minds of those who had underestimated the man in the hoodie. Cameron Blackwood emerged from the executive elevator, with a hurried gait that betrayed his usual composure. His sharp suit, impeccable just an hour ago, now looked crumpled from the stress of hastily abandoned meetings. His face, which had worn the confident mask of a seasoned CEO accustomed to orchestrating billion-dollar deals, was now flushed, a sheen of sweat forming at his hairline as he crossed the lobby toward the spot where Shaquille O'Neal had stood just moments before. He glanced around, his eyes darting in search of an anchor, anyone who might give him leverage in a scene, already tilting beyond his control. He spotted Trevor Langston, who sat slumped in a chair, his expression dazed, a shadow of the smug HR manager he had been earlier that day. Vanessa Carlyle stood nearby, her arms crossed tightly, her gaze locked on the marble floor as though it might provide answers to questions she didn't dare voice. "Where is he?" Cameron demanded, his voice low but cutting, the words lashing through the lobby like a whip crack. Vanessa flinched, her voice catching as she answered softly, "He left, with Kendrick Doyle." Cameron's jaw tightened, the muscles working beneath his skin as he fought to contain his frustration. He paced a few steps, then stopped, taking a breath that did nothing to steady him. "You're telling me," he said, voice thick with disbelief, "that the man sitting in my lobby all morning was Shaquille O'Neal, and none of you realized it?" Trevor's voice broke, thin and defensive. He wasn't dressed like. Cameron cut him off with a sharp gesture. "Don't finish that sentence." His gaze snapped to Vanessa. "Did you know?" Vanessa shook her head, her voice barely a whisper. "I checked the visitor log. I saw the name, but I didn't think." "Exactly," Cameron hissed. "You didn't think." His voice trembled with barely restrained fury. "None of you thought. You saw a man who didn't fit your idea of power, and you dismissed him. You handed him the keys to tear this entire deal apart." As his words echoed through the lobby, the quiet weight of truth settled over the room. And then, without warning, Shaq's voice threaded through the air, not aloud, but layered over the scene like a narrator drawing the audience deeper into the heart of the story. His voice was calm, resonant, and filled with a quiet, unflinching clarity. "You built your world on assumptions. You locked the doors to those you thought didn't belong. But you forgot that power isn't always loud or obvious. Sometimes, it waits, patient and still, until the moment it can't be ignored. Cameron stood frozen, as if the words themselves had rooted him to the marble floor. His mind churned with the realization that the merger, his grand plan, his legacy, was disintegrating before his eyes. Shaq's narration continued, soft yet searing. I didn't need to raise my voice. I didn't need to prove myself to people who couldn't see beyond the surface. The truth was always there, waiting for you to notice. And now it's too late. Vanessa's head lowered, her arms tightening around herself, the weight of her complicity pressing against her ribs. Trevor, his earlier arrogance drained, sat motionless, his gaze vacant as though he had finally glimpsed the magnitude of what he'd lost. Cameron's voice, when it finally broke the silence, was rough and unsteady. We can fix this. We can renegotiate. There's always a way to salvage the deal. But Shaq's voice answered him, the calm weight of it, more final than any contract's closing clause. Some things can't be fixed. Not with words, not with money. Trust isn't something you buy back when it's broken. Cameron turned sharply, his hands slicing the air, as though to cut through the invisible barrier that Shaq's absence had left behind. We'll make a public statement, he said, desperation bleeding into his voice. We'll spin this, say it was a misunderstanding, a miscommunication. No, Shaq's voice cut through the excuses, gentle but absolute. There's no spin, no misunderstanding, just the truth. And the truth is, we're walking away. The words landed like a gavel, final and irrevocable. Cameron's shoulders sagged, his fight drained away, leaving him standing amid the gleaming lobby like a man who had just watched his empire collapse in slow motion. The staff, the security guards, the assistants, everyone who had witnessed the events of the morning, stood in a stunned silence, the realization sinking in that what they had seen wasn't a sudden power play or a hostile takeover. It was something far deeper, a quiet, devastating unraveling of assumptions built on prejudice and arrogance. Shaq's narration softened, the final note ringing with both quiet dignity and an unspoken challenge. Humility isn't a weakness. Listening isn't surrender, but ignoring the truth. That's the real failure. Cameron's phone vibrated in his pocket, a faint buzz that felt jarringly mundane against the weight of the moment. He didn't reach for it. His thoughts spun in slow, heavy circles as he processed the loss, the collapse of the $1.9 billion merger, the public humiliation, the irrevocable damage to his reputation. Vanessa turned to Trevor, her voice low and hollow. What do we do now? Trevor's answer was a faint, broken laugh that faded into silence. As the day outside the glass walls stretched toward evening, the lobby remained suspended in an uneasy stillness. The shadows grew longer, creeping across the polished floor like silent witnesses to the downfall they had just observed. Cameron finally straightened, his expression a brittle mask of composure. Get me a car, he said to no one, in particular. His voice cracked slightly, the command barely holding its authority. As he walked away, his footsteps echoed hollowly against the marble, leaving behind a silence that was more damning than any shouted accusation. Shaq's companies, without fanfare or confrontation, had walked away. The deal was dead, undone, not by contracts or negotiations, but by the simple, unyielding weight of dignity and truth. And as the doors of the lobby closed behind Cameron Blackwood, the quiet presence of Shaquille O'Neal lingered, not as a man in a hoodie, but as the force that had quietly rewritten the rules of the game. Shaquille O'Neal stepped out of the towering glass building into the fading light of the Los Angeles afternoon. The sun dipped low, painting the city skyline in strokes of gold and crimson, a quiet yet powerful contrast to the sharp lines of the skyscrapers. As he stepped onto the smooth pavement, his phone buzzed softly in his pocket. He didn't check it immediately. Instead, he took a slow breath, the warm breeze carrying the faint scent of city streets, a reminder of the world that pulsed beyond boardrooms and contracts. After a pause, he slid the phone from his pocket and glanced at the screen. Congratulatory messages from his team and trusted associates scrolled across the display, brief affirmations of respect and quiet triumph. He let them pass without reply, content to let the moment settle. The weight of the day carried not by words, but by the simple act of presence. The sky above shimmered with the last light of day, its brilliance fading into the approaching twilight. Shaq's thoughts, however, weren't on the accolades or the stunned faces he'd left behind in the lobby. They were on Lucille O'Neal, his mother, whose voice echoed softly in his memory, threading through his thoughts like a steady heartbeat. Dignity isn't just how you stand tall, she had told him, her voice rich with wisdom earned through years of perseverance. It's how you carry yourself when the world tries to push you down. And real power, it isn't about how loud you speak. It's about how wisely you use your strength. Her words layered over the evening air, folding into the quiet beat of the city's pulse. He could almost hear her steady voice as he watched the sun sink lower, her lessons not lost amid the noise of wealth and arrogance, but woven into the fabric of his choices. Today hadn't been about revenge or public spectacle. It had been about patience, about letting the truth unfold in its own time, and about proving that respect once lost couldn't be bought back with money or status. Shaq walked to his car parked discreetly, at the curb. Its glossy finish caught the last rays of sunlight, gleaming not with opulence but with quiet elegance. He opened the door and settled into the driver's seat, his hands resting lightly on the wheel. He didn't start the engine immediately. Instead, he sat there, his gaze tracing the edges of the skyline, the jagged silhouette of buildings rising against the deepening sky. The messages on his phone continued to vibrate quietly, each one a ripple of acknowledgement from those who had witnessed what had happened, who understood the depth of the lesson imparted that day. He let the messages accumulate, not ignoring them but letting them wait, a testament to his understanding that some moments deserved stillness more than response. Inside the building behind him, the echoes of confusion, regret, and silent reckoning lingered in the marble and glass. The merger, once a foregone conclusion, lay in ruins not through aggression or outburst, but through the quiet, methodical dismantling of assumptions. Cameron Blackwood's empire, so carefully constructed on the bedrock of arrogance, had cracked under the weight of a truth it had refused to acknowledge. Trevor Langston's smirk had collapsed into silence. Vanessa Carlyle's brisk efficiency had stilled into stunned contemplation. Their world had been upended, not by chaos, but by clarity. Shaq's phone buzzed once more, a final message arriving at the screen's edge. He glanced at it, his lips curving into a subtle smile, not of gloating but of quiet satisfaction. The message was from Kendrick Doyle, simple and direct. "Well played, boss. They won't forget this." He didn't need to reply. Kendrick understood, just as the others who had stood with him understood. Today wasn't just about a broken merger or a public humiliation. It was a statement, a demonstration of dignity wielded with precision, of a man who refused to be underestimated or defined by the shallow measures of appearance and preconception. As the city lights flickered to life, illuminating the streets below with pools of gold and white, Shaq's mind settled into a reflective stillness. His mother's lessons hadn't just shaped the boy from Newark into the athlete, the businessman, the quiet power behind billion-dollar ventures. They had shaped the man who knew that real strength was measured not in domination, but in restraint, not in volume, but in clarity of purpose. He exhaled slowly, his breath fogging the windshield, momentarily before fading into the night air. The skyline outside seemed to shift subtly, as though acknowledging the lesson it had borne witness to. In that quiet moment, the weight of prejudice, assumption, and arrogance melted away, leaving only the truth of what had transpired. The sun dipped below the horizon, its last rays casting a muted glow that softened the city's edges. Shaq sat back, his posture relaxed, his expression contemplative. He hadn't uttered a word of triumph, hadn't needed to. The silence spoke for him, the power of his presence resonating louder than any declaration. As the evening deepened, Shaq finally turned the key in the ignition, the car's quiet hum filling the space around him. He pulled away from the curb, the city's lights stretching ahead like a path illuminated by justice and hard-earned respect. The building behind him faded into the distance, its glass reflecting the night sky, a silent witness to a story that would ripple far beyond its walls. And as he drove into the night, the lessons of dignity and strength echoed softly around him, reminders that true power wasn't about who shouted the loudest or wore the most expensive suit. It was about knowing when to speak, when to act, and when to simply let the truth stand on its own. Witness how truth and dignity reshape power. Stay connected for more untold narratives that crack open the glass ceilings of assumption. Dive deeper into the real stories that demand to be heard and seen. Your next favorite story is already waiting, where truth always finds its voice.